So chapter 7 is again part of that analysis phase, which I typically, leave it to the students as a self-study, right? And because there's nothing technical here, it's all, what are the different options you have um, as a system analyst to consider, right? I'll just walk you through some of the, main objectives of this chapter, and then we'll let you guys go through that. And if you have any questions, we can discuss it, right? So by this time, a system analyst or a, architect, whatever, based on all the requirements, they have come up with high level, blueprint of the system that they're going to build, still within the logical model. And they have some decisions to make. Whether they're going to be building, what type of system, right? A web-based system, or traditional meaning used to be that client server type of system, right? So that's a decision that they have to make. And also understanding, as it relates to web development, so many things are happening so rapidly, whether we're going to be going to the cloud, whether we have to build the application only for desktops or also for mobile devices, because that's another thing these days. A lot of people expect, including employees, the enterprise applications to be available on the mobile devices, be it tablet or phones. And on top of that, they have to decide, whether they're going to build the software in-house, right? Or they're going to purchase the software, or kind of, go for a hybrid option where you purchase and then customize it. So a lot of, decisions to make, as I said. If it involves outsourcing, what are the things to consider, right? If the company hasn't done that, obviously there's a lot more things involved. If not, you already have a partnership with a consulting organization. You just need to talk to them and get the resources needed for the project, right? And even with outsourcing, there are different options. Whether, the resources are going to be working onshore on the project, or going to be working offshore, or a combination. Again, what are the disadvantage of, offshoring software development? That's something to, keep in mind. And with the cloud, most of the companies, before they go build some software in-house or purchase a software, that's kind of the traditional, software where you have to install, configure, have your own hardware, infrastructure, things like that. Are there any cloud-based software available, right? That you can use. And a lot of those softwares are, in fact, customizable too, right? Configurable, customizable. And that's why, as I said, system analyst is that person, right? Who has been involved right from the beginning of the project. They have a very good understanding of the requirements, and also being this techno-functional. That's what is a term, right? Techno-functional. Techno means they also have a technical knowledge, right, of how systems work, all the things, and also the knowledge about the business and all of the, functioning of the systems that they're trying to support, right? So they're the ones who are one of the main people involved in selecting what is the best strategy for that, project, right? Because doesn't matter what the resource you have, how much money you spend, some of these key decisions you make will in fact affect the outcome, right? Success or failure. So that said, if they do decide to move or go for the, software acquisition, buying some kind of a off-the-shelf software, right? Then there are a lot of steps involved. What are those steps? Those are all things that you're gonna probably see as you go through this slide, right? Maybe we can have an assignment just based off of this chapter. Okay, we'll see. And lastly, as it relates to software acquisition, there are a lot of things. It's by no means a very simple thing, right? You have to go through this so-called procurement processes established within the company, request for a proposal. And then once you get the responses from the different vendors, then, you have to kind of create a list of all the requirements and send another document called an RFQ, so request for quotation. So usually kind of a exam question, right? What's the difference? It means very different things, right? Request for proposal and request for quotation. So that's kind of a high level of this chapter, right? So we're not going to go through everything in detail. As I talked about, we talk about traditional, it's about the so-called client server, and then we have nowadays most people prefer web-based, right? So I'll let you go through all of that steps yourself. And then some of the key things I want to mention is we talked about cloud, and then the main paths of development, right? We talked about in-house purchasing or using outside consultant, be it for in-house development or, even with software acquisition, sometimes you need to use consultants, right? A lot of things to keep in mind in addition to the usual stuff is scalability, reliability, availability, security is a big thing, right? All of those things factor into that decision, right? And some cases they may have all of the desktops to support installing and running those softwares. Some cases, companies don't want to spend money on desktops, so they may just go for some kind of a lightweight desktop model and then have some software which kind of is more of a centralized software where you maintain all of the different productivity tools and everything that employees will access from their desktop, right? It gives a feeling that they do have Microsoft Windows, everything installed on their machine, but it's not. It's kind of a terminal server, right? Companies like Citrix and all of them are into that space. So security is a big thing these days, especially with web-based development. So let's see. And especially depending on the software, right? If it's something that's customer facing, it's always better to be on the web, right? Versus something that's for internal. And that's kind of the way most companies are going, right? If it's internal, I can have a lot of controls and restrictions because my employees, I can expect them to comply. But if it's a customer, then there's only so much, right? You can expect. Again, this is all more on that traditional versus web-based development, kind of for you to kind of look through that. We talked about cloud computing maybe at several points in this course, right? You don't necessarily own the software. All you do is kind of rent it, have a subscription type, which is very popular, right? Everything is available on the internet and works out in most cases, unless, security and other things are of a big concern. And we talked about, considerations around mobile devices. Do I need to support my application on mobile device, right? Because if it is, then developing application for mobile devices, it's kind of a bit more complicated than what, it is for desktop. Because desktop, you just build one site and it runs well on both, in fact, Microsoft Edge or Chrome or Safari usually, right? But for mobile apps, you have to have separate set of tools and programming language. Everything's different, right? Usually for Apple, you use Studio, and then you use a different programming language. Swift is, what's popular these days. And for Android, it's a different set of tool, Android Studio. And then you've got Java language, So you're maintaining two separate sets of, code base, which is more complicated, increases your so-called total cost of ownership, right? So a lot of things to keep in mind, as it relates to having a mobile, version. So this build versus buy is the main thing. I'm gonna build it or buy it. If I'm building it, then I have some options in-house. If I have resources, do I have the time, frame to build everything in-house? Some projects, it's not a set deadline, right? If it's a 6-month project and if you have to request for an additional month, it's not the end of the world. But in some cases, you have to meet those deadlines, right? And no option to extend. So those are all things that will decide, whether the application is built in-house or you have to buy a commercial software. Some cases, it's just buying and installing it, running it, right? Some cases you have to also customize it, right? So that's part of that construction phase. And then implementation is the next phase, right? So go through all of that in detail. I just want to pick on a few points so that as you are reading it yourself, you might, follow it better, right? And a lot of the reasons why companies prefer developing software in-house, right? Why? Because, you can customize it to any degree you want. The only limitation is technology, resources, right? If that's not a limitation, then you can, pretty much get what you want, right? Which is not possible with what commercial software, because that's built to run many businesses, right? And also another advantage is what? It minimizes the changes within your business process versus buying something commercial, which is built for, a lot of businesses, and then you have to tweak a lot of your business process to fit how that software is designed, right? And meets constraints of existing system. You may be integrating your application with so many internal system, external too. So if it's in-house, then you can continue to do that. If it's commercial, then you have to kind of re-implement those integrations and things like that, right? Also helps develop those internal resource capabilities too. Be it learning a new programming language or a, user interface framework, database, so many things, they learn. So that's kind of helps the team overall, but sometimes takes a lot of time too. Purchasing a software, package has its own set of advantages, The cost is lower usually and takes less time to implement because the software is developed. All you have to do is what? Customize it a little bit, and then, if you get the qualified consultants, they can get everything up and running. and train the staff to support it, right? And any kind of enhancements in the future, it'll be offered by the vendor, right? So even before purchasing the software, you can what? Get some testimonials from, or see the testimonials from different companies, and use that to decide whether it's a good vendor to work with and software meets the requirements. Like you go to any business these days, right? First you do is look up Google and then look at all of the customer sort of feedback, comments, and then depending on the star rating, right? It really has a lot of say in your decision making, those stars. Not many people would not go to, for example, a restaurant or anything service that has a 1 star, right? The customizing software package is kind of that, in between, in-house versus purchasing a software, but that involves a lot of things, right? Whether you're allowed to customize the software and what is the extent to which, you can customize, what will happen to the support. Let's see. So these are all things, again, you can kind of look at it, post development, what are all things to keep in mind. They're talking about outsourcing, right? So some of the development work, it could be some of that testing. A lot of things get outsourced these days. Development, testing, user interface. Nothing is impossible these days, with the remote work ethics people have and all of the technologies to support online collaboration, things like that, right? So that said, outsourcing means what are things to keep in mind, right? Obviously, the term is very popular these days. You just pretty much outsource anything you want, right? Be it development or maintenance, operations of your system, right? So it could be either a temporary arrangement or it could be a permanent thing, right? So the reason why they're saying there is so much of growth in outsourcing, because of lots of service providers that provide almost a 5-star service, right? Obviously for a fee. And companies, you may know a lot more names than me, right? Based out of India or other countries, that's their main business model, right? Helping companies with their information technology needs, right? So on top of that, we also have this so-called ASP, which is what? These companies host this software for you, right? And then they allow you to access that software, by charging you some kind of fee, right? So you don't have to typically build anything, just configure and you're good to go. So that's another outsourcing model, and a lot of fees involved, with outsourcing. Some cases it's called a fixed fee model, when you talk about outsourcing, right? Where they bid for a project, based on all the requirements, and they kind of handle all of the aspects, right? Development, testing, and installation and everything. So kind of a turnkey model. And they just charge a standard fee, right? The cost up front, but the advantage with that is the cost, but disadvantage is if there's any change in requirements, then everything is an additional cost. Subscription model is you don't own anything, you're just renting things, be it software, be it network, be it workstation, database, anything you name it, right? Some cases they're talking about usage model. There's no subscription fee, nothing like a monthly fixed fee, but it's based on transaction. How many orders am I creating, on a, monthly basis. So or based on the volume of transaction or the dollar value of the transaction, depending on the model, so many different outsourcing options available. And when it comes to outsourcing, some things to keep in mind, right? You can't blindly outsource. You have to keep in mind whether the system you're trying to outsource, is it a mission critical system or not? In which case, which is kind of main for your business to operate, right? These are systems that are key for your company business operation. So it's a mission critical system. Does it make sense to outsource, even though it may be cost attractive or, reliable vendor, right? And obviously with outsourcing overseas, there's always the cost factor, very attractive, but there may be other concerns about data privacy and, the communication, security, all those things. If you decide to outsource, you got to make sure you're reviewing the firm's history and financial condition, right? How long have they been in business? How many customers they have? What are their customer testimonials? Financial condition, everything needs to be evaluated as part of that decision making. And in some cases, your outsourcing client itself, their businesses could be affected by some of these M&A, merger acquisition activity, right? Although most companies, when they acquire, they always promise the clients, the same or higher level of service, right? But still, if a company is in the process of M&A, then maybe it's something, kind of a risk, right? Outsourcing, another thing is the employee job security concern is a big deal. When they find out, a lot of the jobs are being outsourced, there's always this concern among employees, what's going to happen to me, right? So that has to be managed too. That's outsourcing, and offshoring has to do with completely, doing all of the development and testing, support, operation, everything, outside of the country, in a different country, right? Mainly because of the cost concerns, right? And so many things to, again, keep in mind as we are doing all that offshoring. Again, with the cloud, what can I say? A lot more options available. It all makes it seem very simple and straightforward, but you never know. With cloud, so many hidden costs that you need to understand before you make that decision. So what are the role of the system analyst in this, phase, right? So they are looking at so many things as they're coming up with these different options and providing that recommendation. So it's going to take weeks, to put together this kind of a report. So the team is typically, it's not just one person doing this evaluation selection, usually made up of project managers, system analysts, IT, managers, executives, and sometimes architects. All those people are involved in that, process, and then they evaluate a lot of options and then look at the pros and cons of each, right? And a lot of this is, if you're taking a course on basic finance for managers, right? You're going to look at all this ways of evaluating, the cost benefit, right? Analysis, the different financial tools available to evaluate that, right? So more on this, I'm sure you will read up, in your course on basic financial managers, but these are the techniques available to calculate, based on the projected costs, how much time it's going to take to recover that investment, right? In some case, if it's in-house, it could be, we're spending X amount of dollars, it's going to take us maybe 10 years to recover, right? Versus outsourcing, where it's going to take 5 years, right? So which is a better option? But how do you come to that conclusion is using these kind of financial tools, right? Payback analysis or return on investment. But all of them uses this kind of a thing called net present value, which is what? What is the value of X amount of dollars in the future that I'm going to end up spending in today's dollars, right? I'm going to be spending, say, $1 million in 6 years, right? But what is the value of that $1 million today? Because money by nature is a depreciating thing, right? $100 that's worth today will only be maybe $80, depending on the country and other things, right? Inflation and other factors, 80. In some countries, $100 worth today, maybe only $50, right? So you use that to understand what is the present value and use that for your cost benefit analysis, okay? So all those things we can read up. Again, as far as software acquisition itself is concerned, what are the main steps? First need to understand what are the system requirements, what is expected out of the system, right? Only based on that, you can use that to generate this what? RFP, request for proposal, right? What are the demands of that company as far as that particular application is concerned? What are the features that are desired, right? And then you're identifying the vendors that are going to be getting this RFP and then getting back to you, on who the potential, companies are that can help you with that, right? So a lot of firms that are specializing in this area, and then, once you get the response from all these companies, you're looking at all of that response and then evaluating, right? Based on how long they have been in business, customer testimonials. So it's going to take some time to review all that documentation and kind of come up with a ranking of all those responses, right? So they're going to come up with some kind of a cost number based on the requirements. And then other things, including a lot of the terms and conditions associated with that software purchase, right? So it's kind of a master agreement is what, they call it, supplemental maintenance agreement or master agreement that needs to be reviewed by legal department, make sure everything looks good. And preparing the recommendation based on all the response, we evaluated everything as a team across the cost, the benefit, all of the pros and cons, right? And you're preparing that recommendation for the management, right? Let's see. Batman's presentation to the management, and the management in turn will take some time to decide, right? Whether to go with option A, B, C, or D, given the cost, the risks, and so many other factors, right? And it may also involve, one of the options is what? Hey, thanks for all the hard work, but given some of the costs and the risk to the business and unknown factors, they may decide to just, scrap the whole project, right? That may be one of the outcomes, but in some cases, they may decide to do in-house development or purchase the software, whatever the case may be, right? So this is kind of the point where you have kind of both the logical, right? Designs, in some cases, physical design too, based on the feedback we have received from different companies, right? So that's kind of a high level of this chapter. I want you to kind of go through this as a team, as at an individual level, review all of this, and then we'll see what kind of assignment we can create for this particular chapter, because it's kind of a self-read. So any question on kind of development strategies before we move to our next chapter? Okay. So no question means what I'm going to do is looking at the book. Let's see if we can have you guys do some kind of a case study, right, on this chapter. And that way you can get a much more in-depth understanding of some of the concepts, right? Let's see. RFP. So let's talk about case in point 7.1, Doug's Sporting Goods. So Doug's Sporting Goods sells hiking and camping supplies. Company has grown considerably in the past 2 years. So they want to develop a custom order entry system. Hired your IT consulting firm. Think about your team, right? As an IT consulting firm to advise them about development strategies, right? So they are leaning towards in-house development because they don't want to depend on outside vendors, suppliers for technical supports and upgrades. They also say they're not interested in selling on the web, but that can change in the future. They want to meet with you tomorrow to make a decision. What will you say to them at the meeting, right? So it's kind of a interesting thing to work on, I think, as a team. It doesn't give you too much information, right? So that's where, as a consulting firm, what's the first thing you understand about your client, right? What do they do? Who are their customers and suppliers and things like that? And basic knowledge about that whole sporting good industry itself is very critical, right? Because you're going to be advising that company on what is the best strategy, whether to do in-house development or purchase off-the-shelf software. So that's where you need to kind of get together as a team and debate, decide what is it that you're gonna advise your client, right? So that's going to be your assignment for this week on chapter 7. Okay. So any question on your assignment before we move on to the next chapter? Okay. So that said, we are done with phase 2, which is the analysis phase, right? Now moving on to phase 3, which is also got to do with design. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm just looking at, this is week 6. So we still have how many more chapters to do? 4 more chapters, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I'll go through, chapter on user interface design today, okay? But next week we'll talk about data design, followed by system implementation chapters, which is chapter 11, managing system implementation, and then support. I typically leave interface design as a kind of a self-study too, but since I've already given you a chapter, right? For self-study, I'm just going to go through and discuss chapter 8, kind of in depth, which is kind of this is a very simple chapter, if you ask me. I mean, user interface is the main way you have to interact with the system. So if you think about just today, how many applications you use. So a lot of this is concepts that you have experienced yourself. So, it's kind of a moot point for me to go through every point here, but I'll just, again, as I said, cover the salient concepts, right? Everything to do with interface means what? Whatever you see, whatever you interact with, touch on a application, right? So that's what's called a UI. Sometimes you could hear the term GUI, which used to be kind of old, but now it's all called what? UI, user interface. Especially with companies like Google and Apple that have, created this platform for individuals like you and me, right? To develop software for hundreds and, thousands of people, they need to have some kind of a control in place, right? If not, it's going to be hard. So they have developed all this concept of this HCI, human computer interaction, and provided all those guidelines, right? So if you follow those guidelines, there's a good chance that whoever you're building this application for, they're going to like it, right? So your application will have what's called a user-friendly interface, right? So what are the, 7 habits of successful designers? What are the key things they keep in mind that users want to keep using their application, right? So what are the guidelines for user interface design? So those are the key things, which used to be, again, back in the day when we used to have comprehensive exam, written exam, that was one of the questions, what are the guidelines? On top of the, user interface, you also have other type of outputs to consider, right? The printed output. So what are the guidelines for that? Especially with printed output, you have to have lots of controls in place. We talk about different types of printed, outputs. And what are the trends in UI, right? User interface, especially with responsive web design. If you have developed a website, you probably know what I'm talking about, right? Responsive web design. So UI is how typically users interact with the application, right? This kind of provides you an opportunity to provide an input as well as, see the output, right? So this is the UI is kind of what central to that usability of any application. Without a UI, there's no other option, right, for users to interact with the system. And the key thing with that is what? User satisfaction, because they're the ones who have to use the system and, to perform their day-to-day activities. The folks who develop the software, they're not the ones that are using it, right? They build it and they just move on. And then offer support. So the more the effective the UI design, your system performance will be, based on that, right? The more effective the UI, the more effective the system performance. And you'll be able to support all of the business activities in a more efficient way, right? So we talked about the GUI, and as I said, Apple was the one that came up with the kind of the concept of the GUI back in the 1980s, right? In fact, they were the ones who made the most work with the computers, right? Came up with the concept of these icons and so many things that we take for granted today. But back in the 1980s, it was not that popular, right? So as an end user, you have to remember a lot of things, which may be something we don't think about. People may mistake input as output, output as input, right? So what's the difference, right? As an end user, you can be working with a lot of input devices, which was in ITM 5000 chapter on what? Hardware, software, right? Mouse is an input device. Keyboard is an input device, right? Screen used to be only an output device, but nowadays with all these touch screens, it can become an input device too, right? Never know. So that boundary is it's kind of blurry, right? So why do they do all of this input? Because to carry on their day-to-day job functions, where that input is converted to some type of a data, the system will, process, transform, and provide as an output, right? Or else what's the point of providing an input only to get the same thing back, right? So HCI is something that these big companies came up with, human-computer interaction guidelines, on how, best to achieve that human-computer interaction to help people, perform their jobs. It could be a professional working in a company or a student, studying in a school, right? Doesn't matter. Whatever the case is, the reason you're accessing that application, like I'm accessing Canvas today, is to teach. If it's making my job easier, I will continue to use that. If not, why will I, right? So with the HCI, you have to think about a lot of these days, not just desktop, also smartphones and tablets, and so many things, right? Talking about ubiquitous connectivity means being able to access your applications from anywhere, any part of the world, right? And there's not much opportunity to train end users these days. That's why you have to build these applications so very intuitive to use, that they don't have to look at, spend too much time looking at instructions, right, to learn. That's what, you get by following these guidelines, right? Transparent user interface, something that doesn't get in the way of end user doing their job, right? It's very, very, pleasant to use, not distracting, gets the job done. So what are the main things? Again, this is where I expect you to, after the class, pick up the book, read up the details, because this is what will help you in your finals, okay? Those questions sometimes can be a little tricky. It's hard to differentiate, okay? So as you read the book, maybe once or twice, then it helps you kind of come up with the right answer. Um, so what are the 7 successful habits? It's understanding the business. What am I building this application for? Who are my end users? What business they are in? That's that question you have, right? Case in point, what? 7.1 you're gonna be working on, which is due, let's call it, Saturday night, okay? So you have more time to work on that assignment. So without understanding what the business is, you may be building, based on all of the guidelines, using the best technology. It may not, mean much because end users may not follow, right? They are expecting X from you, you're giving them Y. So that's why very important that as a designer, you need to understand the goals of the business. What is the business function of the application that you're trying to build, right? And how it supports the goals of the business, right? And maximizing graphical effectiveness. Well-designed interfaces, what? Make it easy to learn, speeds up that learning process, right? Should not require taking, looking at pages and pages of instructions or reviewing some video. That's how you need to build it. Think like an user. A lot of the times people just, want to get the job done and move on. So they don't pay much attention. As an end user, what do I expect from this application? What would I like? What are my, likes and dislikes, right? So they should imagine themselves, as that end user when they are designing this screens. Use models and prototypes. Sometimes, a plain, creating the UI, just using some sketches, right? They call it what? Storyboarding. It's very, very important so that you can get it in front of the end users and understand, is this something that aligns with their expectation, right? Presenting those designs to the end user, right? From of storyboards, how the flow, the navigation works, and what are all the different pieces of information they can see in each screen. What are the options, to navigate and complete the actions, right? So to get a lot of good feedback is why people do that. Focus on usability, right? So usability means what? Again, making sure only to have as much information as is needed on the screen. More information doesn't mean, people are gonna like it, right? Offering reasonable number of choices. There should not be too few choices. At the same time, there should not be too many, right? It could be a balance, and that's why that's a key thing. So they're talking about, any UI, right? It has to be kind of a step-by-step process, right? Not everybody can be expected to understand systems at a very expert level. You need to think about somebody who's using the application the first time, as well as somebody who's using it for quite a amount of time. So some kind of opening screen that kind of gives an idea of what are all the main functions of the system, what are all the things they can do, right? Is always helpful. And then inviting feedback is another thing too, right? Where I've done my best to design these screens based on all the requirements, my understanding of the business, their goals and other things, right? But I still need to give option. How far are we meeting your expectation? If not, what can we do better, right? So having that service mentality always helps. And you can also, look at, users using the existing system to get some insight, right? And sometimes even after you build a system and you hand it off to the user, sometimes you may think that they're using it, supposed to use system in such and such a way, but ends up they are completely using it in a different way. So why are they doing that? What can we do to prevent them from incorrectly using the system? Documenting everything. Again, this is a chapter on requirements engineering, right? Any discussions, interactions you have with the management, with the end user, you need to make sure you document, right? That can be handed off to the developers so that they can incorporate those feedback end users. Because the end users, if they don't see their feedback being used, they will not, they'll think that, it's a waste of time, right? So make sure that, you document and pass it on to the end users. Get approval, obviously, before you move forward with any of the designs, from your end users. Let's see. And moving on, right? Guidelines for UI design, creating an interface easy to learn. What can I say? As an end user yourself, with using so many applications on your phone, desktops, or tablets, you expect your application to be what? Easy to learn, right? Or else, you'll just uninstall, move on, right? That's the key thing. Providing commands and actions that are consistent, predictable. You may have 10 screens, but across all of those screens, if my, commands, actions are consistent, then as soon as I move to the next screen or whatever, I can know, okay, this is what we're expecting, right? Allowing users to correct errors. If there's a mistake, say entering an email or phone number, whatever, right? I should be able to prompt right then and there, so that the end user can know what is wrong and then fix it. Like you see with some of the applications where you're updating your password, whatever, right? Clearly labeling all the buttons and icons, always helpful. Using images that are very familiar, right? For example, classic cases, there used to be a time where they used to still use that floppy disk as an icon for saving a document, right? But then it turned out a lot of the people, right? I don't know. I can see what's here, right? If I save file, save. There used to be a time when just to save, it used to be what? Even now it's got a save, right? But that's what they're trying to move away because a lot of the new generation people, they don't know what a floppy disk means, right? Maybe you're used to this, but nowadays they represent this some kind of a cloud, knowing that hey, everything I save goes to the cloud, right? So that's a classic example, using images that are familiar to people, right? Showing all the commands as some kind of a top menu, everything you know. Easy to navigate, return to any level. It doesn't matter which screen you are in, I should have a way to go back to whatever screen I need to, right? Enhancing user productivity, that's another thing, right? Making sure everything is organized in such a way that, it's just reflective of the business process itself, right? And this is another key thing. Not every user is same level, right? Some people like to use mouse a lot. Some people just the keyboard. But the ones who want to use keyboard, provide options for shortcuts. For example, you go to Excel, you may see that a lot of options here. You can operate with a shortcut, right? Like for example, if I say, what's the shortcut for copying? Instead of saying right click and copy, right? I can just do a what? Control S, right? I'm copying, right? Or Control C here, right? Control S for save means copy. A lot of people prefer that instead of using a mouse all the time. It slows them down, especially what? The experienced users. Defaulting a lot of the values in the screen. Nobody likes to enter a lot of data these days, right? If you know there's a value that's most likely the value that they're going to enter, right? Just default it so that if it's not the value, then they'll go change. If not, hey, we already got that skill, you know. So this is kind of an example of the menu, you know, that you design, top level menu, sub level menu. And even there, you need to kind of manage how many levels, right, of menu you can have. Cannot have like 15 levels. It'd be too daunting. Fast find feature. People like to, you know they know what they want. Sometimes they don't have the patience to look for it. So maybe you have a search function in your application. Provide flexibility. We talked about this, right? There may be more than one way to do certain things, like this copying thing we talked about on printing, you know, so that's something you can keep in mind. But again, as think about mobile apps, it's a completely different world, right? Nobody's expecting to use a keyboard, generally speaking, right? They want to use, you know, tap it and then, you know, maybe enter a few bits of pieces of information and be done. Helpful feedback always helps, what they did wrong, and, you know, maybe even after they're done, there's something they can do to improve, how they can use the application always helps. And in the worst case, you know, if nothing else helps, there should be a way for the end user to contact, right, the help desk, be it by calling a number or by sending an email, right? Undo is another thing where I may have accidentally entered something or drawn something. I need to have a way to back out. Displaying messages at a logical place. Any error message, informational message, you know, typically, you know, it should be at the same spot versus, you know, showing it in different places, you know. That is where consistency is a very helpful thing. So look up a lot of this information, right? I don't want to be boring here reading every little thing. Just picking on some of the important things. Letting the user know whether the task is successful or not. Once they hit that submit button, you know, we need to provide some feedback. Thank you for submitting your order. You know, that tells the end user, okay, my order was received by the system, and here is your order number, right? Or if there is a problem, that also need to be echoed back, or, you know, so that, and then some information on how to fix that problem, right? All the messages should be what? Specific, understandable. Short messages that anybody can follow, courteous, professional, right? As far as UI design, what can I say? Attractive layouts always help, right? Consistency, rich application design, using pleasing colors, right? Don't have jarring colors or things on the screen. Having buttons or hyperlink to navigate, it's basic. Talked about titles and messages. Consistency is important. Terminology too, right? So anything, wording, error message, everything should have that consistent terminology. So and if you're designing for a desktop, maybe, you know, Windows look and feel may be helpful, especially for employees, right? Because that's what, again, that's about the company culture. What are all the different applications you have? Do you want to keep that consistency? Do you have some kind of a ERP software, right? A lot of the programs look and feel the same, right? Avoiding complex terms, jargons. You know, as technical people, they like all of the complex terms, right? But End users really don't care much for those. They want to just get their job done, move on, right? Enhancing, let's see. So read up a lot of these things, a lot of good information there. When there are multiple choices, obviously, you can have a selection box or things like that. If not, using a radio button or a check mark selection boxes always helps. Trying to avoid as much as you can user to enter data with the keyboard. That's a big thing. If there is something date-wise that has to be entered, use a calendar control. Don't expect people to enter, numbers like 03 and 01, 2024. It's too much of data to enter. Also, opportunity to mess up, right? Not everybody knows that it has to be this YYMMDD format, right? So using that calendar control always helps. Making it very, let's see, descriptive caption for every field, right? Every field needs to have a caption. It has to be very short, concise, easy to understand, right? Allowing users to add, change, delete, view records. I mean, obviously, anytime you're interacting with an application with an input, you're probably creating a record, or in some cases, updating, right? But depending on authorization, sometimes you may have to only provide options to view. Some cases you'll give option to add, change, right? Some cases delete. In some cases in the system, you may be storing information with leading zeros, right? It's a 10-digit field, but I don't expect all my users to be typing all the 10 characters. Sometimes, they only need 2 characters. Rest will all be zeros, right? So don't expect end users to be typing those leading zeros. So that you need to have the system fill for you. We talked about default value. Providing the users the opportunity to confirm. That's the confirmation screen or review screen that you see before you place the order, right? Is this the products you want, quantity, address, everything, right? Make sure that review screen is available, opportunity for the end user to update information before they submit the order. Validation wise, lots of validation has to be done before the customer can, save the order, right? So it could be sequence checks, existence checks, data type, range, depending on the field, right? Some of these things may be applicable or a combination, range check with data type, right? So those things are very, very essential. Other type of check, reasonableness check, for example, think about age, right? If I enter 200, then that's maybe a valid number, but it's not reasonable, right? So you have to check for that. Combination is when 2 or more fields, data are connected, then we have to make sure that they both match. So managing data means once you collect the data, right, make sure that everything is verified. If something doesn't look good, then we need to notify the end user to correct that, because we cannot process our order without that correct data, right? Reducing input volume, always helpful. The minimum the data we need to capture from the user, the better, right? Especially for mobile. some data that keeps getting, used repeatedly, then there's no need to input that. You can always copy it from previous screen. Using codes are always helpful rather than description. This is mostly for experienced users, right? So the reason we do all of this is what? Because of data being what? One of the most valuable assets for a system, right? So they say garbage in, garbage out. If the data I'm collecting is garbage, then whatever I'm processing and output, what can I expect? The quality of that output to be, So that's why we need to take maximum care to collect accurate information so that we are storing good data, and whatever decisions we make out of that will be a valid, right decision, right? Source documents can be many things, right? We talked about keyboards. It could be a document you're scanning. As far as output documents are concerned, there are so many different types, right? It could be a detailed report, a summary report, everything having its own what? Format, right? If it's a order placement form, then you need to have a heading, control zone, some instructions, and the body, like you see in an email, right? Total and authorization, that's the format. Especially when it comes to output, right? Printed output, right? So many things need to be considered, which probably we never bother, right? Who is this for? What is the information that they want? That'll be helpful for them, right? If it's for a manager, mostly it's summary information, right? If it's for a line worker, maybe it's more detailed information. And where should that output be redirected to? You cannot be just printing in any printer in the company, right? Because somebody may get their hands on some kind of a confidential document, right? So those things need to be considered too. Sometimes, the output device, you may be printing a document that has a lot of graphical things. May not be best to use a what? Dot matrix or kind of a, non-laser printer, right? So those things, again, more granular. Report development itself is a big, activity, takes time, right? Because we need to understand what is it that the end user wants from that report, right? Especially with companies trying to what? Reduce the consumption of paper. Any kind of printed reports, we need to ask, do you need actually a printed report or some kind of a PDF document? And, if so, how do we deliver the document, right? It's a printed report, you send it to a printer. If it's a PDF, maybe it has to be sent through an email, right? Reports need to be easy to understand, obviously. What are the different sections of a report, right? See, every report has to have a header, footer, right? A report header and footer, and every page has to have its own header and footer, right? There's some fields that are repeating within the body, right? So those are to be expected, and consistent design, right, across all the pages. That's an example of some kind of a detailed report, right? Of employees and their working hours. Maybe I should, zoom in, right? So what are the different data elements we were showing? And, some may be textual, some may be numeric, some you need to sum up, right? All those things need to be understood. And multiple pages. What are the different type of reports available? Detailed report, exception report, summary. Detail means what? I've got a summary as well as detail, right? And exception means what? Sometimes, you may be generating some reports that has to do with things that did not work as expected, usually with the batch process. In that case, I need to know what happened, what went wrong, what can I do to fix it. So I need to generate those exception reports, which may be of a different format than your detailed reports. Summary reports, obviously, just talk about the high levels, right? Mostly for managers and up. So that has a different format. Output technology wise, we talked about printing, we talked about, the usual, screens, and maybe nowadays there are other types of outputs too, right? Even sending a PDF through an email is kind of an output, right? Because it can be delivered through so many different ways. Especially nowadays, people are using what? Internet, right? So if it's an internet, then how do you deliver that information to my customers, my employees, right? Rather than an email, maybe I have to use some kind of a third-party document management service, like companies like DocuSign, right? And Citrix has their own services too. So you will have to partner with those companies, subscribe to the service, and integrate with their system using the APIs, provide the data format, and then they'll generate the report, and you provide a link to your customers to download it, right? In a safe and secure manner. Nowadays, also you can provide webcast is another form of output too, right? So email, blogs, instant messaging, all those things available these days, right? Especially for both internal, external communication, email is a big tool. A lot of people are using blogs these days to communicate to a broader audience about products and other things. If it's internal, we talk about instant messaging a lot to help expedite getting things done, create that collaborative, atmosphere, right? And then wireless device means what? Pretty much your smartphone, right? How can I provide access to all of this information through a smartphone? Let's see, digital, fax, and a lot of those different options depending on the company, right? If you're in a media marketing space, maybe podcast is a big thing, entertainment industry, right? I need to provide a ability for my content creators to generate podcasts and put it up in what? App Store or Google Play, things like that. So that I can sell those podcasts and generate revenue for my company, right? Even think about other types of outputs, ATM, plotters, all are different types of outputs. Moving on. Security. This is another very important aspect people don't normally think about, right? Both with input as well as output. Input wise, make sure the data that we're capturing is valid information. It won't do something bad to our system, right? But especially with output, all of these reports that we are generating needs to be only accessed by authorized individuals because lots of information contained in those reports, right? So you need to have appropriate security and control in place because of data protection and all those, right? Diskless workstation is something that a lot of companies are using, right? All of the information that you're generating, storing is all in a central drive, be it in a storage area network or using some kind of a cloud drive, right? So that employees cannot just copy information, right? Or somebody who's leaving a company cannot steal a hard drive. And it has happened in the past, right? Input control wise, we're making sure the data is correct, complete, and secure. Whatever data we have needs to be accurate, complete, also needs to be secured. Only authorized person can access information. be it through application or be it through a database, right? And anything that's accessed needs to be traceable, especially who updated the information, who deleted. Data security policies, procedures protect data from loss or damage. These policies need to be in place and followed so that you're not in a situation where there's a lot of data loss and theft, and then you're having to do a lot of damage control with your customers, right? Especially data retention policy, right? Every company needs to maintain the records of the customer, vendor, product, so many things for X number of months, years. And that all is depending on the legal requirements, right? Sometimes they say 5 years, 7 years. Banks may be longer, right? You need to understand all of those policies as a system analyst, architect, and then design your system to comply with those policies, right? Audit trail is what? Knowing who changed what at any given point in time. And a lot of the trends that are emerging in this GUI space, modular design, right? Any application I design needs to be in a modular fashion, right? And making sure that every module is just dedicated to performing, a dedicated function, not combining too many things into one thing, right? Because that can be confusing to the end user. Responsive web design is what? Anybody know what responsive web design means? If you have done web development, you probably know. What does that mean? Okay. So responsive web design means designing an application so that it will work well both on a desktop as well as what? On a tablet, smartphone, right? And there are a lot of frameworks like Angular and React.js and so many things available, right? jQueries, they call media queries that will make your application render, properly, regardless of the size of the screen, right? And you can try that yourself by what? Going to some of the popular sites like what? Maybe, let's see, CNN.com, right? So if it's a responsive application, then if I change the size of the screen, look at that. Changes, right? The layout, everything is accommodating automatically. Detects the screen size and changes things. That's kind of a responsive design for you. Prototyping is, again, in addition to creating the storyboarding, that you can also actually use some tools to create screens that are almost looking like real screens, and you allow end users to interact. That way they get some real good ideas on how to effectively design the application, right? Versus finding everything after everything is built. So it can be a very good tool for getting a lot of feedback. Prototyping is just creating a working model of a system, again, with some kind of mock data and almost screens that look like real, right? But the disadvantage of prototyping is what? Throwaway work, right? You really cannot use it. You're just getting feedback using that, and then you have to re-implement with something more realistic, right? Let's see, trade-off benefits. So what are things to avoid, right? System developers can avoid misunderstanding, right? Because of lack of communication, right? System analysts can misunderstand what the end user wants and communicate something that's different to the developer. So there's a big chain of communication, which can result in what? Information getting lost along the chain. So need to make sure that doesn't happen through that constant interaction and feedback and doing demos, which is all what? Part of Agile, right? Managers evaluating working models, right? So rather than just looking at things on paper, they are looking at demo sessions versus looking at some kind of a brochure, right? Procedures always help post system implementation. Let's say potential problem with modern things fast. So that can result in quality issues, happens all the time. We need to be aware of that. A very high quality job, right? Even impacts system testing too, because testing so especially system and test it with something like real or almost data that's real, right? I'm seeing that it's saying my okay. UI, user interface design. So any questions on this chapter? I know it's kind of a simple chapter, but even with something as simple as what? UI design. So anybody, any questions? Okay, well, this person joined us now. So